All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes. I want to welcome everyone to the University Hour event for this week, Hostage of Empire, Constitutional Dimensions of Puerto Rican Birthright Citizenship. My name is Ricardo Perez. I am professor of anthropology and coordinator of the Latin American and Caribbean Studies program on campus. I am really happy to see so many students, professors, staffs, members of the community, which I really appreciate your support. And I want to talk very briefly before asking Dr. Venator Santiago to make the presentation for this afternoon. In 1917, the United States Congress collectively naturalized the residents of Puerto Rico under the terms of the Jones Act. Although this was not the first or last citizenship law applicable to Puerto Ricans, the Jones Act was the first law to naturalize the residents of a territory that was not meant to become a state of the Union. As part of today's talk, we will learn about the history of the extension of U.S. citizenship to Puerto Rico and the debates over the constitutional status of persons born on the island today. Although Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States, Puerto Rican political and economic affairs are seldom discussed publicly with the rigor that they should. In addition to the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the extension of the U.S. citizenship to Puerto Ricans in February of this year, other equally significant events seem to have been neglected by mainstream media. Two quick examples of this neglect are the crushing financial crisis of the Puerto Rican government, estimated to be over $72 billion, which has led to massive cuts to education, healthcare, and other necessary public services, and the increasing rates of immigration to the United States during the past 5 years, which some experts consider have surpassed immigration rates during the peak years of the Great Migration of the early 1950s. Unfortunately, it is usually when potentially catastrophic natural events such as hurricanes create havoc that Puerto Rico and other Caribbean islands in general come out of the shadows and into the public spotlight. You probably have seen that Puerto Rico is being slammed by Hurricane Maria as we speak. So this is obviously an indication of the threat of most of these natural disasters that, again, bring Puerto Rico and other countries like, again, Dominica or the Virgin Islands or Barbuda out of the shadows and into the spotlight. Today's presentation, therefore, presents us with a unique opportunity to hear from a leading scholar how the political relationships between Puerto Rico and the United States have evolved into the present, and how examining them carefully can help us explain the current political and economic conditions on the island today. So let me say a few introductory remarks about our speaker. My good friend, Dr. Charles Venator Santiago, is associate professor with a joint appointment in the Department of Political Science and El Instituto, or the Institute of Latino, Caribbean, and Latin American Studies at the University of Connecticut. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and teaches courses on Puerto Rican and Latino politics, Latinos and the law, immigration, political theory, and public law. His research focuses on the relationship between the status of unincorporated territories and United States global empire, with a special focus on political status questions, citizenship, public health, and political participation. His most recent book is Puerto Rico and the Origins of U.S. Global Empire, The Disembodied Shade, that came out in 2015 with Routledge Press. Presently, he is revising a book manuscript, Less Than Equal, A History of the Extension of U.S. Citizenship to Puerto Rico, and a shorter primer, Hostages of Empire, A Short History of the Extension of U.S. Citizenship to Puerto Rico, 1898 to the present. Between 2012 and 2014, Dr. Venator Santiago was president of the Puerto Rican Studies Association and currently serves as its treasurer. Finally, he is coordinator of the Puerto Rican Citizenship Archives Project, an online database forthcoming with the Yukon Libraries Scholar Collaborative. I want to make a few quick explanations before moving on to the presentation. We want to give ample time for questions and comments. So we're going to ask students and people in the audience to wait until Dr. Venator Santiago finishes his remarks. We're going to end by 4, which is obviously the time that we have been allotted for university hour. I know students and faculty may have a class at 4, myself included. So we're going to finish promptly. So probably around 3:50, there should be some time if you need to leave for your classes. But again, if you don't have to leave yet, we're going to stay until 4 p.m. There is an attendance sheet on this table here that is for everyone, not just for students, because we would like to have a record of how many persons attended this event. And I think that's all I have to say right now. So join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Venator Santiago to Eastern Connecticut State University.
I promised I was going to be succinct in my talk, so I'm going to put my timer here and see if it works. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. As I was mentioning to Ricardo, who I know for 10 years. I just realized I've been in the area for 10 years. What I want to talk to you today is the result of a series of arguments that I've had for the past 2 years with a whole range of folks. And I want to give you a sort of condensed version of that. In the interest of full disclosure, this talk is sort of part of a series of debates that's taken me to the United States Supreme Court and helped me craft an argument against the President Obama Solicitor General. I'm involved in several lawsuits. I've had a chance to argue with several judges, federal, state, and local, and the list goes on. So hopefully I won't have to shed a pound of flesh, because for the past 2 years I've been grappling with lots of staunch ideologues across political lines. So today, what I want to do is tell you the story, or a brief story, of the history of the extension of citizenship to Puerto Rico. And then as time permits, I'll explain some of the constitutional debates that are still being debated. Some of these debates have made it into popular media, as I don't know if you've seen John Oliver's discussion of the territories. I happen to work with him on that, on the territory stuff, and I can tell you more about those debates later. But they're still present, because there are a couple lawsuits that are addressing some of the inequalities that are created by the territorial status of Puerto Rico and the other territories. Okay, so before I begin, let me thank or acknowledge Professor Perez for inviting me to the university hour. I decided I was going to prepare a brief presentation PowerPoint just to help you direct you, or help you sort of follow me, rather. But thank you again for inviting me to this presentation. Okay, so in recent years, the question of the citizenship status of Puerto Ricans has come to bear, or come to light, in relationship to the Tuawa versus United States, which is the American Samoa case. By the way, does anybody know how many U.S. territories belong to the United States today? Or how many territories the United States has today? The United States has 2,200 islands, but of those 2,000, all over the world, 40 different borders. But of those, there are five territories are considered to be the key inhabited territories, which include Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, American Samoa, Guam, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. Well, recently, a group of residents from Samoa requested citizenship. Persons born in the in American Samoa acquire a nationality and have to undergo a naturalization process in order to become a U.S. citizen. So we were involved in that debate, and we raised some questions that the court rejected and Congress decided to ignore. In addition to that, in relationship to the fiscal crisis, the question has come up on whether the United States Congress should assume responsibility over the financial debt of Puerto Ricans, which is now hovering closer to $200 billion for lots of reasons. $72 billion is what's owed to Wall Street. There's the public pension plan, and there are bonds that are not declared, and they're municipal debt. I mean, it's a mess. It's an unpayable debt. In addition to, as Professor Ricardo Perez mentioned, this year we commemorated the centennial of the collective naturalization of Puerto Ricans under the Jones Act of 1917. And the question of citizenship has come into the forefront in the plebiscitary status debates. In June 11 of this year, the statehood party managed to mobilize something like 22% of the electorate to vote for pro-statehood status plebiscite, which is not going anywhere for reasons that are fairly obvious, but we can talk about those later. But the central debate there was, according to the statehood party, that if Puerto Rico chose to vote for another status option, Congress could involuntarily denaturalize or strip them of their citizenship. That, of course, is incorrect, and it's a lie, but they still made the argument. Until the Department of Justice had to return and say, no, you're lying to the American public. You have to change the ballot and speak clearly and honestly. But central to the debates, recent debates, is the question of what is the status of Puerto Ricans, or rather, persons born in Puerto Rico. Are Puerto Ricans or persons born in Puerto Rico on the island born in the United States? Are they born elsewhere? And what type of citizenship do they have? Today, I want to walk you through some of these debates so you have a sense of what type of citizenship is applicable to Puerto Rico. Before we do that, let me give you a little background. Puerto Rico's territorial status was invented by the U.S. Department of War during the Spanish-American War. It was normalized by Congress in something known as the Foraker Act of 1900, and the Supreme Court gave it a stamp of legitimacy in something known as the Insular Cases. In other words, between 1898 and 1901, the United States invented a new territorial doctrine, new territorial law and policy to govern territories that had been annexed or permanently acquired, but which were populated by non-white populations or inhabited by non-white populations. The United States occupies Puerto Rico on July 25, 1898, and imposes a 2-year military dictatorship in or following the cessation of hostilities. And again, this is a well-known practice that comes out of the Civil War, where the United States military just simply puts a series of governor dictators to essentially rule territory without granting individuals access to civil rights. Amidst or during that process, on December 9th or 9 December 1898, the United States signs the Treaty of Paris, formally annexing or providing for the formal annexation of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And it subsequently ratifies this treaty in April 11, 1900. These dates are really important because they're going to determine when Puerto Rico is where. And I'll clarify that in a minute. Unlike all prior treaties of territorial annexation, and remember, the United States began with 13 colonies or 13 states, and we've grown to 50. The United States. So the United States had a long history of acquiring territories long before it acquired Puerto Rico. In fact, all U.S. territories, continental territories, were acquired prior to 1850, with the exception of Hawaii and Alaska, which were subsequently conquered, made into states as late as 1959. But prior to 1898, all treaties of territorial annexation established that once the territory is annexed, it was placed in a path to statehood. If the United States did not want to grant statehood to the territory, then it did not have to annex it. In all territories of territorial acquisition, either contain a clause or promise to contain a clause or include a clause granting or providing for the collective naturalization of the inhabitants of the annexed territory. In the case of Puerto Rico, or rather the Treaty of Paris, the Senate and President McKinley decided to defer to Congress. In other words, it granted Congress the power to subsequently extend citizenship, civil and political rights to the island. And this word extension is really important, and I'm going to return to this in a second. Okay, in 1900, Congress enacts the Foraker Act, which provides a civil government for Puerto Rico. And it also includes a provision extending something known as the Dingley Tariff. The Dingley Tariff imposed a duty in this case, in the case of Puerto Rico, a 15% duty on merchandise trafficked or transferred between Puerto Rico and the United States. For anyone who's familiar with constitutional debates, that represented a violation of something known as the Uniformity Clause. Connecticut cannot impose a tariff or duties on goods that are transferred for traffic between New Jersey and the state. Just because Governor Malloy doesn't like the governor of New Jersey doesn't give the General Assembly here the right to impose a tariff, because that would destroy the local economy if different states engage in these sort of tariff fights. So the Supreme Court historically has established that it is unconstitutional to impose internal tariffs within the U.S. territory. However, Congress, enacting legislation, special legislation, decided to treat Puerto Rico as a foreign territory for domestic or constitutional purposes. Soon after, within months, the Supreme Court began to affirm the new insular or territorial policy initially developed by the military and now normalized by the Foraker Act of 1900. And it said, yes, you can do that. You can treat Puerto Rico as a foreign country in a domestic or constitutional, for the domestic or constitutional purposes. In particular, the logic of this argument is outlined in a case known as Downs versus Bidwell. It's a 1901 Supreme Court ruling which received a plural opinion. In other words, there was no majority opinion. There were 5 different opinions issued. And not one of those opinions acquired a majority of votes to win. However, there was a sort of coalition of conservatives. And one of the concurrent opinions, the opinion by Justice Edward White, a Southern Louisiana sort of Confederate, former Confederate, invented what has since been described as the doctrine of territorial incorporation. And simply put, this means that the United States can treat unincorporated territories as foreign territorial possessions for constitutional purposes. Now, unlike other debates, imperialist debates more precisely, the United States still had to guarantee basic fundamental rights to these territories. Not the full Bill of Rights, but basic fundamental rights. What those fundamental rights were, we still don't know. It's been more than a century and the court refuses to clarify what are fundamental rights. But since 1901, Puerto Rico has been governed as an unincorporated territory under something known as a doctrine of territorial incorporation. Simultaneously, Congress has used something known as the doctrine of extension to argue that it has the constitutional power to extend or withhold constitutional provisions through legislation. So you have the doctrine of territorial incorporation embraced by the court that basically says this is a foreign territory in a domestic or constitutional sense, and then Congress holds this power to enact legislation that extends or withholds the Constitution. Now, for anyone familiar with constitutional law, that is unheard of, with the exception of perhaps the plenary powers doctrine in Native American cases, because the Supreme Court wields or has given itself the power to interpret the Constitution. The idea that Congress can interpret the Constitution and extend parts of the Constitution to places is unheard of. But in this case, that's what Congress has been doing for 200 years, not just with Puerto Rico, but with all territories. And Congress invokes the power given to it by something called the Territories Clause. The Constitution enumerates the power of Congress to essentially govern territories. Okay, I'm going to return to this because this is really important. Since 1898, Congress has debated upwards of 102 bills that contain citizenship provisions for Puerto Rico. And as Professor Perez noted, we're going to be releasing all of the legislation for the past 100 years, all the citizenship legislation for Puerto Rico, and all the laws and all the legal debates. Don't worry. For Puerto Rico in a database where you will have access to essentially download and look at all the legislation for the past 100 years. We spent the better part of 10 years working in the Law Library of Congress, downloading and copying microfiche files and now PDF files of every piece of legislation addressing citizenship and status debates for Puerto Rico and all the territories. And we're going to make them available to the public, hopefully in a month. Everything's already loaded. It's just a matter of editing. In addition to that, Congress, or rather the Senate, approved one treaty, the Treaty of Paris, containing a citizenship provision, which I'll explain in a minute. And since 1898, Congress has enacted 10 different laws extending 4 different types of citizenship to Puerto Rico. Not just one law, but 10. These include a Puerto Rican citizenship, an individual naturalization, or the right to an individual naturalization, a collective naturalization law, and then the question of birthright or jus soli citizenship. And remember, I already mentioned the Supreme Court has established that Puerto Rico is a foreign country in a domestic and constitutional sense. But Congress has decided to treat Puerto Rico as a part of the United States for birthright citizenship. That's almost like saying you can be born in Cuba. If you're born in Cuba, you can still be born in the United States, if Congress says so. But I'll clarify that in a second. Okay. So what is this question of the non-citizen nationality and the Puerto Rican citizenship? In 1898, as I mentioned, the Treaty of Paris invented this idea of a local nationality that basically said the inhabitants of Puerto Rico are entitled to some local nationality, but not U.S. citizenship. Now, what's really interesting is that the Senate and the President created a distinction between peninsula-born Spanish citizens and insular or Puerto Rican-born Spanish citizens. Whereas peninsula-born were allowed to retain their Spanish citizenship or acquire U.S. citizenship or acquire Puerto Rican citizenship, Spanish citizens born in Puerto Rico were barred from acquiring any other type of citizenship other than the nationality ascribed by the Treaty of Paris. In other words, the idea was that those who had been born in Spain and were residing in Puerto Rico could have options to choose their citizenship, whereas those who were born in Puerto Rico would be limited to retaining their Puerto Rican nationality. The Fork Act of 1900 essentially creates a Puerto Rican citizenship, invents it. There is no such thing as a Puerto Rican citizenship in the U.S. Constitution. There are only 2 types of citizenship in the Constitution. Citizenship by naturalization under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4, or the 14th Amendment, which grants birthright citizenship. That's it. But Congress, in its wisdom, invented a new citizenship, which has been described as a Puerto Rican citizenship. This idea was eventually described as a non-citizen nationality, a status in between an alien and a citizen, which is a status that American Samoans have today. But Puerto Ricans, in the case of Puerto Rico, established the precedent. As a result of a million administrative problems of colonial government, Congress in 1906 begins to enact legislation allowing individual Puerto Ricans to naturalize. In other words, under the premises of this provision, Section 30 of the Bureau of Immigration Naturalization Act, Puerto Ricans could travel to the United States and undergo a process of naturalization just like any other immigrant. And dozens of Puerto Ricans in New York, hundreds if you look at the United States as a whole, took advantage of this law. And the idea was that they could travel, a person born in the island in Puerto Rico could travel to the United States, to the mainland, to a state, to a territory, and just simply go through a process of naturalization. This law was amended, or subsequently amended, in 2 occasions, in 1914 and 1918, essentially allowing Puerto Ricans who served in the military to count their service as residency in the United States for purposes of naturalization. So in other words, if you served in the Navy, you could count your service as a pathway to become a citizen. Now, mind you, Puerto Rico had been annexed to the United States, but Puerto Ricans were not considered to be, until this moment, naturalizable. They were considered to be racially different and inferior. In 1917, months before the United States declared war or declared their agreement to enter the war, the United States began the process of collectively naturalizing Puerto Ricans. This decision was made in 1914, not in 1916 or 1917, as some nationalists argue. Some nationalists today argue that the idea of collective naturalization was designed to recruit cannon fodder for World War I. That's just a myth that has no historical foundations, but it's popular. Anyway, the Jones Act of 1917 contained a provision that essentially allowed Puerto Rican citizens to either retain their citizenship or acquire a U.S. citizenship by simply doing nothing, by simply living in Puerto Rico. This is known as a collective naturalization. It also allowed aliens to acquire a U.S. citizenship by signing a simple declaration in a court of law, and it allowed the children of aliens to acquire U.S. citizenship once they reached the age of 18, or by simply going with their parents to a court of law and declaring the desire to become a citizen. Now, this last one is really important and really controversial because the United States was still using the doctrine of coverture. Is anybody familiar with the doctrine of coverture? Under U.S. law, at least until the 1920s, some people would say to the 1930s, once a woman married a man, the process of marriage was a form of naturalization. So if there was a U.S. woman citizen who married an alien, she, by the process of marrying that alien, acquired the citizenship status of her husband, and their children acquired the citizenship status of the father, at least until the 1930s. Some people would argue until the enactment of the Cable Act of 1922, but it's a more complicated conversation. But in the case of Puerto Rico, there are hundreds and maybe thousands of children of aliens, namely Puerto Ricans who married the next door neighbor, the Peninsular-born Spaniards. And there were plenty of stateless Puerto Ricans, and would remain so until the 1940s. Now, because the Jones Act did not change the territorial status of Puerto Rico, persons born in Puerto Rico were born outside of the United States, were born in a place, in a territorial space that was tantamount or equivalent to being born in Italy or China. And I say this because this is one of the key debates that lingers today. A lot of people today argue that birth in Puerto Rico is the same as birth in China or Italy today, notwithstanding what Congress has said. So in other words, the only way that citizenship could be transferred for anybody born in Puerto Rico after 1917 was if their father, not the mother, but the father was a U.S. citizen who could transfer citizenship by blood right, because being born in Puerto Rico was still tantamount to being born outside of the United States in a foreign country. The conflict between the territorial status of Puerto Rico, the citizenship, the Jones Act citizenship law, and a series of immigration naturalization laws prompted Congress to amend the Jones Act on 3 occasions, in 1927, 34, and 38. The basic amendments of Section 5 of the Jones Act essentially included corrective measures to retroactively naturalize persons born in Puerto Rico. The 1927 bill, or amendment, was designed to give Puerto Ricans who had chosen not to acquire U.S. citizenship the opportunity to reacquire a United States citizenship. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but in 1917, 288 Puerto Ricans had refused to acquire U.S. citizenship. They later acquired it in the 1927 bill. In addition to that, aliens and the children of aliens were given an opportunity to reacquire U.S. citizenship, or rather acquire U.S. citizenship. The 1934 amendment is really important because it introduces for the first time the idea of retroactive naturalization of Puerto Ricans. It creates a territorial birthright citizenship, establishing that any Puerto Rican born in the island between April 11, 1899 and 1934 would acquire a birthright citizenship. But this was, again, limited to Puerto Ricans who were born in the Puerto Rican territory. This was not a blanket birthright citizenship, as we will see in 1940. And in addition to that, it extended the Cable Act of 1922, which was designed to eliminate, or begin to eliminate, the doctrine of coverture. Again, in the United States, it was passed in 1922. In Puerto Rico, it would arrive in 1934. Like most laws in the United States, they're first passed here, they're tested out in the United States, civil rights are tested, and eventually they trickle down to the territories. We can talk about that later. And then in 1938, Congress again retroactively naturalizes anybody who's born in Puerto Rico. And the problem there was that, again, by 1938, you had thousands of Puerto Ricans, for a number of reasons, who were stateless, who had no citizenship whatsoever. And that created administrative problems for ruling the colony or the territory. Between 1898 and 1940, anyone born in Puerto Rico and acquiring a U.S. citizenship, or Puerto Rican-born citizens, were treated as naturalized aliens or naturalized citizens. In other words, for legal purposes, persons born in Puerto Rico before 1940 were considered to be naturalized citizens. They had the same status as an alien, even though Puerto Rico had been annexed to the United States. And this created a number of problems that would linger until 1948, or rather 1952, and we can talk about those later. In 1940, Congress began to enact legislation extending, or rather treating Puerto Rico as a part of the United States for constitutional purposes, or rather for citizenship purposes, and in order to extend jus soli, or birthright citizenship. The Nationality Act of 1940 essentially treated Puerto Rico as an incorporated territory for the sole purposes of conferring this birthright citizenship. What happens is that anyone born after January 13 or January 12, 1941, the date in which the Nationality Act is enacted, is now born in the United States and is a birthright citizen. This law was affirmed in 1948 and later in 1952. So since 1940, or rather 1941, anyone born in Puerto Rico, regardless of the status of their parents, acquires birthright citizenship for purposes of the United States Congress or United States legislation. However, the Supreme Court has never changed the territorial status of the island. So according to the Supreme Court, being birthed in Puerto Rico is the same as birth in Italy. Because it's never ruled, it's refused to rule on the question of citizenship, even though it's had at least 4 cases prompting it to decide whether territories are in the United States or not. Simultaneously, Congress has progressively extended legislation that treats Puerto Rico as a part of the United States for purposes of extending birthright or citizenship. A birthright citizenship that, according to Congress, is based on the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And my alarm is just ringing. So let me stop there. Any questions? Let me begin by clarifying. Any questions? How should I match? Should I just start picking, folks? I have 1 over here and 2 over here. Yes?
Okay, so under the current rules for Puerto Rican, I think it's best if you use the mic. So, okay, under the current rules for a Puerto Rican birthright citizenship, could someone born in Puerto Rico after 1940 be elected as U.S. president?
You know, this is how I started looking at this question, because John McCain was born in Panama, right? He wasn't born in the United States, and the Constitution only contains 2 types of citizenship. Birthright, you're born in the United States, or you're naturalized. And John McCain was actually naturalized, just like Senator Ted Cruz under blood right citizenship laws. So that's a great question. Here's the problem. Persons born in Puerto Rico meet almost all of the requirements. They're natural born based on legislation. They can fulfill the residency requirements, and they can fulfill the age requirements of Article 2. The problem is that Puerto Rico doesn't have an electoral college. So remember, in the United States, we don't have a democracy. We have a Republican system of government where the Electoral College essentially selects the president. You can't even vote for the electors in most states. You can be an elector and you can decide not to follow the vote. I mean, there's all kinds of protests. So the simple answer is if a person born in Puerto Rico relocates to Washington, D.C., a district with 3 electoral votes, or a state, then they could meet the constitutional requirements to be considered or to run for office. If they're residing in Puerto Rico, there are constitutional doubts because Puerto Rico doesn't have an electoral college. That question has never been resolved. Justice Stephen Breyer wanted to resolve it in the Chihuahua case, and there's a case pending right now or working its way up to the court, the Segovia case. But no, a person born in Puerto Rico while residing in Puerto Rico cannot run for office. If they relocate to Connecticut, they migrate, then yeah, they're natural born, they fit all the requirements. The moment that a native-born Puerto Rican steps into the United States, they acquire the whole mantle of civil and political rights by design. I had another hand, yes?
So would a birthright citizen of Puerto Rico have the same constitutional rights that I do being born in a state of the U.S.?
So the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court addressed this question in 1922 in a case known as Balzac versus People of Puerto Rico. This was 5 years after Congress had naturalized everyone. And in this case, the question of the right to trial by jury came up. as a result of a defamation case. And the Supreme Court said then, and it has continued to reaffirm until most recently in 2016, the moment that a Puerto Rican-born citizen steps in U.S. soil, in a state or incorporated territory, he or she acquires all the constitutional rights of any citizen by merely stepping on the soil. So,
But if they stay in Puerto Rico, they don't have it.
in unincorporated territories, the rule is that the Supreme Court primarily chooses to extend or withhold constitutional rights. So for all the 5 territories, for the past 100 years or so, the Supreme Court has cherry-picked what rights to extend or withhold. So for example, today, the 6th and 7th Amendments right to trial by jury do not apply to any U.S. citizen living in the territory. So if you decide to relocate to Puerto Rico and go hang out at the University of Puerto Rico, and for some reason engage in some sort of criminal activity, or you're accused, I should say, and you want a trial by jury, you're not guaranteed constitutionally a 6th and 7th Amendment right to trial by jury, because the Supreme Court states that the right to trial by jury doesn't extend to Puerto Rico. Now that varies from territory to territory. The court has said these rights extend to these places in these kinds of ways. But no, the doctrine of territorial incorporation establishes that these are foreign locations for constitutional purposes, therefore the Constitution doesn't extend on its own force, ex proprio vigore. So the short answer is no. There are different kinds of rights that apply differently in different territories. I'm sorry, if you really want to get a sense of this, there's a 1991 report issued by the U.S. General Accounting Office titled Insular Areas, the Applicability of the Constitution, and it walks you through each constitutional right. It's published by the U.S. General Accounting Office. Yes?
So am I to assume that equal protection clause under the 14th Amendment does not apply to Puerto Ricans who are in Puerto Rico?
So, that's a great question. The court has said it's either the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment or the 5th. So the court has never clarified which one applies. But equal protection applies to Puerto Rico by jurisprudence. It's just not clear whether it's from the 14th or the 5th. And the debates are really important because if it's the 5th, if the source is the 5th Amendment, then Puerto Rico doesn't have the same federal standing as if it was coming from the 14th.
Is there precedence for that at all as yet? 14th and Puerto Rico?
Nothing has been, we came close with the Sanchez Valle case in the summer of 2016 with a double jeopardy case, but the court ignored everything and steered away from it in a bizarre ruling. There are 2 precedents that affirm that due process applies to Puerto Rico. They just don't tell us what's the constitutional source, either the 5th or the 14th. But due process does apply in Puerto Rico, and equal protection of the law also.
My question, if the Congress will allow Puerto Rico to determine what they want, for sure, what are the discolonization forms that are accepted by the international community? And what is the hesitation of something called República Asociada?
Okay, so you asked me a big question. The debate around the status has been locked in, and I'm part of this conversation because I was asked to refute one of these problems so that we could move forward. The debate has been locked in basically around 2 questions. One is, what do you do with the citizenship status of persons in Puerto Rico? And the argument there is that upwards of 90% of the population will want to retain their citizenship status regardless of what the status of the island is, for lots of reasons. I argue, and I'm in a minority position here, supported by the Trump administration, ironically, and Congress, and the State Department. And when I say I've been accused of influencing the Trump, and I have nothing to do with that administration. But they recently took a position affirming my argument. I argue that regardless of the change of the citizenship status of the status of Puerto Rico, you can't strip anybody of their citizenship. And because they have due process rights, they have equal protection rights, and because Congress did something different in 1940. So that question has been taken out of the table, but that hasn't trickled down to people yet. The second question is, what do you do with the economy? How do you sustain the economy? I say those 2 things because those are the 2 impediments to have this conversation. If you take a local poll, I think they're evenly divided between statehood and a Commonwealth argument. within the Commonwealth argument, the territorial status quo, there's something along the lines of an associated republic, a sovereign republic, and they argue that they can amass around 25 to 35% of the electorate in that direction. What that would mean is that Puerto Rico would be governed by the State Department rather than by Congress. In other words, they would become an associated republic under the purview of the State Department. If Puerto Rico were to become a state, or try to become a state, dead on the water, for one simple reason. Puerto Rico has a similar population to that of Connecticut, so it would be entitled to 5 congressional seats and 2 Senate seats. And Puerto Ricans vote Democrats, so you don't need to be a rocket man to know that the Republicans aren't going to give Puerto Ricans 7 seats, or any territory for that matter. So the statehood question is out of the picture. The Commonwealth is in disarray because internal politics have prevented them from sort of reaching a consensus. So they're not mobilizing anyone either for the sovereignty alliance or for the more conservative tradition. And the independence movement only garners about 4% of the electorate. This year, a Facebook campaign garnered 3 times as many votes as the Independence Party garnered. The Independence Party garnered in the last election something like 30,000 votes, and the Facebook campaign garnered 150,000 votes. So in terms of movement at a local level politically, there is no movement in any direction other than statehood. Now, the problem is that the last plebiscite only mobilized 22%, 23% of the electorate. So there's no movement anywhere, and there's no leadership to galvanize any movement. And there's no leadership locally that can mobilize any movement. As for Congress, I think that I've had a chance to look at all the legislation, 135 bills. Congress would prefer to maintain a Commonwealth status because it's more profitable. They don't have to deal with the headaches of a state, a dependent state, financially dependent state, and they don't have to deal with the disentanglement of independence. Disentanglement means how do you deal with mortgages? How do you deal with retirement, Social Security, all the benefits that all the links that Puerto Ricans have to U.S. economic institutions. So the simple answer is that there's no political will to move anywhere, or at least not enough to move the island in any direction, and Congress has no interest other than promoting some sort of Commonwealth status quo. And the Supreme Court affirms this logic in the Sanchez Valle case and the Franklin, California Supreme Court rulings of 2016. The Congress right now has a great deal because they impose a 7-member unilateral, basically autocratic regime on the island that controls the government. 7 unelected, some are bankers, some are professors, that basically tell the government how to spend their money and what to do. So in that sense, Congress is creating the conditions to essentially run the island without any headaches, so long as the population doesn't challenge the Fiscal Review Board. And so far, they haven't. They've actually supported the fiscal review, ironically, despite all the destruction that's coming from the policies from the Fiscal Review Board. Yes?
So why is it, in sections of the literature, there is this view that America is a reluctant imperialist?
There's no reluctant.
And so I'm wondering if there is some special reason why this reluctance to make people you conquer citizens of America. Say, unlike the Roman Empire, they conquer you and you become a Roman. So why you think this is the case in America? What is really holding them back?
So I think there are 3 basic answers. One is when we talk about the literature, there are 2 types of literature. The secondary literature that is premised on all kinds of ideology, and then the primary archival text. I study that primary archival stuff. When you read legislative debates, the legislative history of bills, there's no reluctance. Most lawmakers were racist, misogynist, and clear that they were going to subordinate the empire, and they're honest about the language. Now, that literature is largely inaccessible to the public until recently. I had to go to get access to that literature. I had to microfiche. It took me 5 years to microfiche those documents. Focused, 8 hours a day, So I think part of it, there hasn't been enough research on that particular literature that's honest about the issues. The third answer, I think, is the most convincing answer for me, is that the average American doesn't have a clue. I mean, if you look at the last 2 public polls, the YouGov Economist polls, the majority of our United States residents didn't even know that Puerto Ricans were citizens. I mean, I work in a college town, and I went to Webster Bank 2 months ago to deposit a check that my mother had sent so I could buy a gift for my son or her grandson. And they asked me, what currency is this? And I'm in Webster Bank in a college town in a progressive blue state. And people are still asking. I was just talking to my doctor, and she said, when did you immigrate to? 2 weeks ago. So I think the idea of the reluctant, I understand that when I read the secondary literature, that's what we see, the reluctant. But the primary literature is very honest about the racist intentions and the profitability. But I also think the main issue is that there's just no clear understanding among the public. I mean, when only 28% of the population understands that persons born in Puerto Rico are citizens, and they've been citizens for more than a century, then I think that would explain the reluctant sort of imperialist stuff, that the average American or U.S. citizen doesn't really know what's going on. I mean, I don't know, I'm not trying to cop out on the answer, but that's my personal opinion. You're all being soft with me. Yes. Yes, Professor.
No, it's very interesting, and I'm just going to tap into what's going on at the moment, and I think we exchanged a few words before the presentation, but maybe you can expand a little bit. We were talking about this notion of first, second, third-class citizens, and so on, and now with the storms and the whole effort that's going to take to rebuild all these places affected by these natural disasters, what do you think is the status of Puerto Rico? I mean, in a way, what is the obligation of the federal government to help in the reconstruction of Puerto Rico, and to what extent? I mean, one would be obviously the political implications of helping that, but in constitutional terms, how far should the government help Puerto Rico to rebuild its damaged infrastructure?
So this is a lesson for anybody who's thinking about voting for the Affordable Care Act replacement. Because Puerto Rico, the doctrine of territorial incorporation establishes that Puerto Rico is a foreign country in a domestic or constitutional sense, Congress has decided that it's only going to extend block grants to the territories. And the Supreme Court affirmed the power of Congress to discriminate against the citizens of Puerto Rico in a case called Harris versus Santiago Rosario, which was essentially an effort by the federal government to extend aid to families with dependent children. In other words, to extend equal benefits to women, single women with children in Puerto Rico, equal benefits that they would be entitled in the United States to the island. And the Supreme Court said no. Congress has the power to discriminate against local citizens because Puerto Rico is not a part of the United States. It's not a state of the United States. What that means is that Congress could enact, and has been doing this for the past 100 years, legislation that extends a portion of benefits that citizens would otherwise be entitled to if they were residents of a state. This is how bizarre it is. If I retire from the state of Connecticut and I go to live in Ecuador or France or Bolivia, I can receive full Social Security and my supplemental Social Security income as a former resident of Connecticut. If I go to Puerto Rico, my benefits are reduced drastically because Puerto Rico is considered to be a foreign location for constitutional purposes. So I lose my residence and I lose my benefits. So right now, what's going on is that the Congress and the Trump administration are arguing that U.S. citizens that live in Puerto Rico, by law, are not entitled to the same benefits, financial benefits, that would be otherwise available to a U.S. citizen if you were to do a calculation, to a U.S. citizen living in the United States, because Puerto Rico is not in the United States for constitutional purposes or for purposes of federal aid. Does that make sense? So under Harris versus Santiago Rosario, Congress has the power to discriminate against citizens in terms of benefits. And that's what it's been doing for the past 100 years, or 118 years. And that power is justified under the doctrine of territorial incorporation. In concrete numbers, we were talking earlier, Texas is about to receive, or is slated to receive, upwards of $150 billion. Puerto Rico, the last numbers that were released, is slated to receive something like $600 million. And Puerto Rico has been devastated. U.S. citizens living there are not only dealing with their situation, but they're also creating refugee camps for the residents of all the other islands. Again, I don't think we need to compare miseries. Texas suffered misery, and Puerto Rico, but financially, the United States has the power to discriminate in terms of the extension of benefits through block grants.
Yeah, thanks. That was really interesting. I'm trying to get my head around this moment in 1917 that citizenship by naturalization is extended to Puerto Rico. Is that right?
Yeah.
And it seems so contradictory because that's the exact moment in which the U.S. Congress is beginning to roll out like a number of really racist immigration restrictions simultaneously that will exclude people from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and other parts of the world, Asia, Africa, et cetera. So I'm just curious how they like balance that contradiction in their thinking, that on one hand, they're extending citizenship rights to Puerto Rico, and at the same moment, they're restricting citizenship rights from all other parts of the world. So what was it? What was the motivation for that extension of citizenship rights at that time?
So if you read the legislative histories, the debates in Congress, the reports by Congress explaining what's going on, the committee reports, the hearings, what you will find are three things. One is, in the case of 1917, is that in 1914, Felix Frankfurter wrote a memorandum stating you can grant them citizenship without binding Congress to grant statehood to Puerto Rico. The moment that the military recognizes that they can separate the two, they get on board. In fact, by 1906, 1914, the military was supporting the extension of citizenship to individuals who were loyal. And the reason why they were reluctant to extend citizenship is because once you, well, first, Puerto Ricans were likely to join the military, but once you grant them citizenship, they're eligible to become officers, receive higher pays, and they can demand rights that are not available to aliens serving in the U.S. military. The basic answer is that the extension of citizenship, of different types of citizenship, is for administrative purposes. Puerto Ricans who are traveling outside the United States find themselves having to pay taxes, unable to get passports, unable to essentially move within the empire. So when you look at the debates, Congress and the military are saying, well, it's just too much of a headache because every time we have a Puerto Rican in Spain or France or something, it's creating a court case, the State Department's getting involved, and you see all this memorandum saying, let's just resolve this without binding Congress to grant Puerto Rico statehood. On the question of race, it's really bizarre. If you read the primary documents, lawmakers are just honestly racist, and they're clear about it. They don't hold back. But they also understand that the Puerto Rican population is somewhat more white or more malleable to become whiter in their language. So you'll see frequently reports that say, well, yeah, Puerto Ricans are 2/3 white. So they're different than Guamanians, for example, who are somehow Chinese. Even if they don't understand that there's something called Polynesia and China. But in their minds, it's just a very racist representation of Guamanians. And then the third argument, I think, is a question of idea. There are liberals in Congress, even at this moment, that see the opportunity of the ability of Congress to grant citizenship to rectify some of those wrongs. And I think they like all congressional debates, they're liberals, they're conservatives, they also have a voice, and sometimes they manage to get their bills through. So in fairness, there were some liberals who believed that this was the best route for the United States to rectify their past discrimination, which was pretty clear if you read the congressional record. So I would say it's a mixture of those three. But the basic element is that it's an administrative problem for the United States. And everything is solved in 1940 when they grant birthright citizenship without binding Congress to grant Puerto Rico statehood. I don't know if I'm out of time, but I'm here. Oop, sorry.
I have one last question. Okay. Got it. Okay. So when this previous question, when you were answering between the different types of citizenships and how Congress, at the same time is retaining citizenship and not trying to give it out. With the DACA students that we have, especially on Eastern's campus, there seems to be a divide between Latinos that are Puerto Rican and the rest of Latino America, which don't have citizenship. So me as an RA, it was difficult to try to understand, because I do have a lot of DACA residents, to try to understand where they're coming from, because I've never had to go for a green card, never had to immigrate the way they have. So when you mentioned that we as in Puerto Ricans were granted citizenship because of racism and we're more likely to be white, what about those DACA students that don't even speak Spanish? Because we have Puerto Ricans that don't speak English at all, but yet we have DACA students that have never been to their homeland since the age of 2, probably don't speak their native tongue, but yet they still have to go, they're not white enough to be granted that special citizenship regardless of where they come from or where they resided before. So do you think it could be an idea to bring up later down the line or within those chains of command that DACA students, especially those contributing to the United States and the economy and to education and all of those different things, could be granted the same sort of citizenship that Puerto Ricans have outside of their country while they're residing in the United States?
Yes, Mary.
I know, it was big, sorry.
So let me, I'm not sure there are different debates, because the idea of DACA is talking about individuals, whereas the case of Puerto Rico is talking about a territory that confers a particular type of status. So DACA students is still a DACA student in Puerto Rico, but a U.S. Puerto Rican-born citizen is different if he or she travels to the mainland. The first answer is, they're conservative Puerto Ricans, they're liberal Puerto Ricans, and they're progressive left. So when I think about Puerto Ricans, I think about the spectrum of ideologies that some Puerto Ricans embrace all kinds of different political ideologies. In the case of DACA, I think I'm in favor for normalizing the status of DACA without having to do the military service or educational service or civil service that various versions of the DREAM Act are proposing. But that's just my position. I'm on record on that. I think the way out for DACA students right now would be following the California precedent or the California lawsuit precedent, the debates that are setting up in California. And it goes something like this. President Obama granted, through an executive order, as a representative of the United States government, granted me a status. And removing that status from me would be a violation of my due process rights, because the state acted to grant me, through an executive order, a legal mechanism, a particular status. And I complied with the state. Now, I think that's the way to go in dealing with this question, that there are some due process rights that were conferred by the definition of DACA. I don't know how the courts are going to react. The courts have put a stop to President Trump, at least some courts, to the Trump ban. But some courts are also affirming the Trump position. So I can't predict what's going to happen. But I'm sympathetic to the idea of using that legal argument. I think at the end of the day, it's a political issue. The Democrats are negotiating with the Trump administration on whether to grant DACA and negotiate with the border wall. And unfortunately, these young students are being caught in the middle. They're essentially political pawns for a game, a money game, I think, because building the border is more about money than about anything else. It doesn't really make any sense to build. You can't even build a border. Physically, the geography doesn't permit the border. So the idea of applying the Puerto Rican precedent doesn't quite make sense to me, because when we talk about DACA students, we're talking about DACA students in Connecticut, we're talking about DACA students all over the United States. We're not talking about territorially bounded students.
But they are territorially bounded in the United States. Same thing as Puerto Ricans. We don't have all of the constitutional rights if we're residing in Puerto Rico. But the second we step on U.S. ground, we have all of those rights necessary.
And undocumented students here acquire basic fundamental rights by living here. The question is whether the courts are going to implement those rights or accept it. And I think the way around that is to say, hey, the law, an executive order gave us a status, and to strip us involuntarily would be a violation of our due process rights. And there's a lawsuit that's going on or that's been initiated in San Francisco, I think, along those lines. Beyond that, I don't know how to respond to that argument because the immigrant population is one of those populations that are essentially in the border of in and out. Sometimes they're in, sometimes they're out for constitutional purposes. And the court has adopted a plenary power argument similar to that of Native Americans, where it says, we can do whatever we want with immigrants, including murder them. And as we saw in the Hernandez Mesa case, an ICE agent in El Paso, Texas decides to shoot a kid. And the court basically said, review the precedent. We're not going to say anything about it. The Supreme Court in Hernandez versus Mesa. Or the kidnapping cases of Mexicans under Verdugo-Urquidez. So I think the route to go is through make a political statement as much as possible and fall back on the legal argument on due process claims. But I don't know. I'm at it. But I'm available at UConn. I'm at El Instituto. Send me an email. I'm happy to be a resource if I can.
All right.